Hi, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well. As promised, here is another recording option for our class coming up this week that will focus on both the development of motivation, which is what this article aligns with, and then also the question of theoretical integration and whether it is just questions surrounding kind of that idea based on what we've learned so far. So in this recording, I'm going to be covering the Muenks and colleagues article, which focuses on the development of learners' competence beliefs specifically. So as a little bit of an overview for this recording is going to look a little bit different from previous ones that I have shared in this class, because I felt like with this article, it made more sense to kind of weave together the summary points and then the points that I wanted to encourage you to think more about, and sort of I don't want to say critique, but points that I wanted to comment on further and highlight for all of you. So usually I kind of separate those and talk about summary points first and then themes and points to highlight. Today, I've kind of integrated them into one. And then as usual, I'm going to conclude with a few questions to grapple with. So the first thing that I want to say from both kind of a summary point and a commentary perspective is I want to highlight at a macro level some things that I encourage you to take away from this article. And in particular, I think that this article is incredibly helpful for anybody who is interested in focusing on competence beliefs, whether you're interested in focusing on especially K-12 students' competence beliefs, but then also a little bit about teachers and the role of other socializers, things like that. I think that this article is such a valuable quote unquote one-stop shop for as a resource for learning about this material and as an excellent starting point for where you might go next if you're trying to familiarize yourself with more literature on this topic. So in particular, I think that this article I would flag as a really helpful go-to article or reference or starting point for, first of all, defining competence beliefs across theoretical perspectives, although I think that this article especially leans into an expectancy value approach, but it's certainly not limited to that. You've probably noticed that there are a lot of theoretical perspectives and competence beliefs related constructs covered in this article. It's also really helpful for kind of a summary of how competence beliefs can be and have been measured in previous work. So if you are looking to define or develop a study of your own, let's say, or whether it's for this class or another class, propose a research study that involves the measure of competence beliefs, this is a really great place to start. And then also a really helpful resource for beginning to understand how children's competence beliefs develop throughout childhood and adolescence. And for a similar go-to reference of a kind of really helpful review that focuses on the other set of constructs that we've talked a lot about in this class, specifically the why do I want to do this questions or the reasons for engagement, things like task value or intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, goal orientations. Those are all examples of the why do I want to do this or why do I not want to do this constructs that we've covered in this class. For a similar go-to reference, I would recommend, I believe it's Wigfield and Cambria 2010. And I think it was also published in the same journal, Developmental Review. I could be wrong about that though. But take a look for Wigfield and Cambria 2010 if you want kind of a similar go-to reference for kind of understanding the development of students and other learners' reasons for engagement. And definitely let me know if that isn't enough information. I wish I had put the citation on the slide. So if that isn't enough information for you to find this article and you're interested in getting your hands on it, don't hesitate to let me know, and I'd be happy to share it with you. Okay, so again, taking together some key like macro level things I think to take away from this article is that I think that it's a really helpful one-stop shop for understanding how competence beliefs across theoretical perspectives are defined, 2, how competence beliefs can be and have been measured in the past, and 3, how children and adolescents' competence beliefs in particular develop through these kind of developmental stages. Okay, so now a few things kind of related to my own thoughts and reactions related to some things that they mentioned about how competence beliefs can be measured. So the items that they talk about related to measuring expectancy for success, which of course we've learned is subsumed with most often within an expectancy value model of motivation. These items are still used quite frequently, and that and they're cited and they're talked about in this section. One thing that actually surprised me that was not present within their overview of different ways to measure competence beliefs is I'm surprised that they didn't mention the use of one of the most common scales out there for self-efficacy, which is referred to, the acronym is PALS, P-A-L-S, or the Patterns of Adaptive Learning Scales, I believe is how you spell out that acronym. And I wanted to make sure to mention that because that measure, the PALS measure, which is widely available if you just Google it. If you Google PALS, P-A-L-S, and then self-efficacy, it should come up. The whole manual should come up really easily. And that is a scale that's certainly not perfect. No scale is perfect, but it's one that is very kind of commonly used, and for better and maybe for worse, just like all commonly used measures in our field, it's kind of widely accepted as a pretty valid and therefore trustworthy measure of self-efficacy. They also mentioned Harder's items related to competence beliefs as a common measure for how to assess these constructs. And I'll just comment to say that although I think that there's potentially a lot of value in Susan Harder's items, just to put it on your radar that I don't see a lot of people using these items anymore. And personally, and I'm sure that there's a really valuable and really compelling counter argument to what I'm about to say. But if you take a look at the article and see how Harder's items are summarized and described, something that gives me a little bit of pause, or would give me a bit of pause in using these items in my own work, is I'd be cautious about the social comparative element to them. So curious, of course, as always, if anybody has any thoughts related to that, but I did just want to mention that although they talk about Harder's items as being a pretty common way to measure competence beliefs, I don't see, at least in the motivation scholarship that I read, I don't see them being necessarily used as frequently as the other measures that I've mentioned to assess either expectancy for success or self-efficacy. I think as well, a really valuable part of this article speaks to or pertains to their recommended considerations about which measures to adopt. Because for those of you who have had some experience conducting research, you know that decisions like which measures you should use are ones that are really, really important. And it's kind of challenging to backtrack once you've made the decision and once you've already collected your data using a specific type of measure. It can be, again, really hard, if not impossible, to kind of take a step back from that decision. So I think that there were kind of 4 major things that they highlighted as things to either consider when you're thinking about which competence belief measures to adopt, and just sort of other related points of consideration. So the first thing that they say is the importance of matching the specificity of the measure with the outcomes themselves that are being measured. So let's say, I think that this was an example that was provided within the article. Let's say that you were interested in measuring expectancy in math specifically. You want to know about how successful students believe that they will be in math, in the upcoming year, let's say. The corresponding outcome, according to the authors, should be math performance. So that similarity of, and the level of specificity of domain ideally should be the same. This is really easy to say and sometimes actually more challenging than you would think to do, but I completely agree with the author's recommendation that for so many different reasons, because these motivation constructs that we've talked about are so domain specific rather than domain general, it's really important to match that level of specificity between the competence beliefs itself, themselves, and then the outcomes that are measured. The second consideration that they talk about is how important it is to match the measures that are used with the theoretical foundation of the study. A kind of tangible example of this is that if we are drawing from, let's say, social cognitive theory, then what these authors are recommending is that you measure self-efficacy specifically, because self-efficacy is a construct that is subsumed under social cognitive theory. To provide a counterexample to that, which I am actually guilty of, and I'll explain why, if anyone's interested, it would be too much of a tangent for this recording. But what a lot of researchers do is they actually don't necessarily follow this consideration. And there's a certain degree of mismatch between the specificity of between the measure used and the theoretical foundation of the study. So for example, there's a paper that I'm working on right now, and this actually came up as a critique in our reviewer comments, rightfully so, that we measured students' self-efficacy specifically, but the theoretical foundation or the theoretical perspective that we drew from was situated expectancy value theory. That's an example of a mismatch between the measure and the theoretical foundation. And there are lots of reasons for doing this, but the really important argument, I think, that aligns with the author's recommendation to make sure that there's methodological and theoretical alignment is that this can create, if there's a lack of alignment, it can create a lot of confusion in the literature that relates to the conversation that we'll have this week about theoretical integration, the potential benefits of integrating across theoretical perspectives versus the shortcomings. And also specifically, one of the possible readings that you'll consume this week that relates to what's referred to as the jingle jangle fallacy, where depending on whether you're talking about jingling or jangling, sometimes we use certain labels for particular constructs that don't align with the definitions, that then don't align with the measures. And I know I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but the key thing to take away is the second consideration that they mentioned that I think is really important for us to think about is matching the measure used with the theoretical foundation of the study. And a failure to do so, although many of us, including myself, can be guilty of this approach, a failure to do so can create a lot of confusion in the literature that can then sometimes attenuate the application of our research to education, policy, and practice. The authors also recommend, from a kind of measurement perspective, thinking very carefully about the need to develop another measure rather than using an existing measure. And basically, the authors elaborate on this by saying that there are just so many different measures out there to assess learners' competence beliefs. Adding another new measure, rather than one that's really well established in the literature, is perhaps like arguably unnecessary, and then again can just contribute to confusion as sort of a worst case scenario. In terms of sort of my commentary or my perspective on this recommendation, I partially agree with the authors in the sense that I think that an unnecessary number of measures can just create a lot of additional noise and confusion. However, my kind of counter argument that I encourage all of you to consider stems back to some themes and topics of discussion that we discussed from the very first day of class, which is that we need to think really carefully when, let's say that we're really interested. And again, I'm giving myself this advice just as much as, if not more, as I'm giving all of you and other people in the field. But when we think about self-efficacy, for example, and the use of the PALS survey that I talked about earlier and how widely used it is, we need to think about, and we need to do some reading, I would argue, about what kind of populations the PALS measure of self-efficacy was normed or developed based on. For example, there's a lot of work actually that has administered the PALS survey across development, meaning of learners at all different developmental stages. But initially, it was normed on students who I believe were in, let's say, 5th grade. And 5th graders might think about self-efficacy, and very likely do, and we actually know this from this article, very differently from how, let's say, adult learners might conceptualize self-efficacy and their specific efficacy experiences. As another example, and this pertains more, this kind of relates more closely to what we've been talking about since the very first day, we know that the overwhelming majority of students that are represented within, and the population more broadly that's represented within the motivation literature, identifies as white and middle class and often come from more westernized societies like the United States, Canada, Australia. And we don't necessarily know the extent to which those measures that are so frequently used in the literature are going to be reflective of other learners' experiences who have different social identities that are much more underrepresented within the literature. So all of that is to say is that the third kind of consideration that they provide, specifically to think very carefully about the need to develop another measure rather than using an existing measure. I agree with in a sense, but I also would kind of encourage you all to consider the counter argument to that recommendation that I just provided. Just given what we know about the motivation literature, who is well represented within that literature and who is less well represented. And then the final consideration that they talk about when it comes to thinking about which measure to adopt relates back to a point actually that I have already made, which is to think about how appropriate extant measures are for certain ages. And specifically, they cite really interesting evidence that younger children may interpret items quite differently than the researchers intended them to. And I think that this is such an important point and speaks to the importance of more frequently using measurement techniques like interviews, for example, to really get at what maybe especially younger populations of learners are thinking about when we kind of present them with a given set of items, let's say on competence beliefs. So that's kind of my summary, but then also commentary related to the measures of competence beliefs that were shared within the article and what kind of considerations the authors encourage us to consider, to be redundant, for me to be redundant, when we're thinking about which competence beliefs measures to adopt in our own work. This part of the article, specifically the development of competence beliefs, I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail from a summary perspective than I have about the previous sections in the article and then the other sections of the article that follow this development section. And the reason why is, of course, because this week, the major reason for assigning this article, although I think it is so valuable from start to finish, we're really kind of seeking to learn more about competence beliefs from a developmental perspective. So that's where I've kind of chosen to devote the most amount of detail from a summary perspective. So they begin this section on the development of competence beliefs by talking about some really interesting, in my opinion, early precursors to expectancy beliefs. So before, expectancy beliefs in given academic domains are well formulated, what are some psychological experiences that serve as early precursors that end up ultimately influencing these expectancy related beliefs. A couple of bottom lines from this section is, first of all, the authors point out, which I think is really important, and I know that a number of you are very interested in those kind of early childhood education years, that reactions to success and failure, even if expectancy beliefs don't stabilize until later, those reactions to success and failure begin really early, like as early as potentially the preschool years. And even in these preschool years, some children, not all, display reactions to failure that aren't ultimately optimal for motivation, that positions students for success and really positive experiences within and beyond academic contexts. Another important bottom line to take away from this section on early precursors to expectancy beliefs is that one reason of many why these early precursors are so important is because these reactions lay the foundation for the development of more kind of better formulated expectancies for success and competence beliefs more broadly. Then the authors transition to talking about changes in students' understanding of expectancy and or competence-related beliefs. So the authors, as a quick aside, the authors use the term expectancy quite a lot throughout the article, which makes a ton of sense for a number of reasons. I'm kind of coupling that with language that refers more broadly to competence-related beliefs, since expectancies is more kind of closely tied to a single theoretical framework, in case you're wondering why I'm doing that. If you notice kind of a difference between my language and the author's language. One thing that's important about the literature that they review on changes in students' understanding of expectancies and competence-related beliefs is they talk about some really interesting and kind of older work coupled with some newer work in this area that focuses on, as I just said, students' understanding of ability. And specifically what that work has found is that children seem to develop an understanding over time that effort and ability are related to each other in a compensatory manner. So meaning what children continuously or increasingly believe over time is that the more effort that you need to put into a task, that must mean that you have less ability, and vice versa. If you don't need to put a ton of effort into a task and you're still super successful, then to older children compared to younger children, that would signal a higher level of ability. So that's what they mean when they say that effort and ability are related to each other in a compensatory manner. And of course, this is kind of directly related to the idea as well of mindsets that we've talked about, at least peripherally in this class. And the authors also mentioned that from initial work, and John Nichols, I believe John is his first name, John Nichols was the scholar who really contributed a lot to this early literature on students' understanding of the nature of ability and how they think about effort versus ability and how that changes over time. What more recent work has demonstrated is that it seems as though this kind of understanding of the inverse relation between effort and ability seems to begin developing much earlier than expected in early childhood, where Nichols kind of initially thought that this kind of development about the compensatory nature of effort and ability and children's beliefs related to that seem to develop kind of much later. But anyway, more recent research seems to suggest, according to this article and then according to the empirical literature that they cite, that this kind of more advanced understanding of effort and ability seem to begin developing much earlier than Nichols thought. And the authors talk about the fact that this is really important, an understanding of learners' understanding of ability and how it changes over time. It's important because children's expectancies become more accurate once they are better able to distinguish between effort, ability, and outcome, which I thought was, again, really interesting. They also talk about work that is focused on children's understanding about both the nature of ability and intelligence. So that maps on to Dweck's work on mindsets and causal attributions. And one thing, or a couple of things that I'll say that I think are kind of important bottom lines about the content that they cover in this section, is that the nature of students' beliefs, and specifically thinking about causal attributions, change over time. So it seems as though right around the time that children transition to adolescence, around 11 years old, they seem to make different types of attributions about effort, and specifically seeing it as more internal to them, something that's controllable, and something that is less stable. And I think compared to their younger counterparts, and I think that that has not only really important implications for children's competence beliefs or learners' competence beliefs, but then also important implications for how we as educators might try to make sure that students are making the most kind of optimal, or even though I don't love this word, kind of adaptive attributions possible. So an important bottom line of this section that focuses on children's understanding about both the nature of ability and intelligence, and then also causal attributions, is that younger children seem to have pretty different views about the nature of ability and how the nature of ability relates to effort and performance. And the authors kind of position this conclusion as important, especially for the goals of this article, because they help us to understand why and how negative changes in expectancy related beliefs emerge. And then the one of the final things that I'll say about their, or that I'll comment on about their section related to the development of competence beliefs, is that they also then transition into a really rich discussion about change in mean level and stability of children's competence beliefs. And a few important bottom lines to take away from this section is that it's a really well-established finding that competence beliefs tend to decline pretty dramatically across elementary and secondary school. However, the nature and the magnitude of this decline depends on a whole host of different factors like academic domain, gender, and as the authors talk about later on in their article, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, or I don't think any time, I don't know what I have on the slides coming out, but I don't think any time talking about this, but it's a really important section about how socializers can also play a really important role in not only kind of shaping students' competence beliefs, learners' competence beliefs, but also shaping the kind of magnitude of change over time. Another important bottom line from this section about changes in mean level and stability is that expectancy and competence related beliefs more broadly also become much more stable over time, which I think has really important implications for education. And I don't know, it might be a really interesting springboard for a discussion on during our next class. So that's that. And then just a couple of other things that I will share kind of from both a summary and then also a commentary perspective are the really important points that the authors made related to how these competence related beliefs ultimately relate to performance. Something that I really want you to take away from this, because I think that it's, again, really important for theoretical understanding and then also very important for practical application, is that expectancy-related beliefs are very powerful predictors of performance. So we've talked about these competence-related beliefs and then the reasons for engagement. Why do I want to engage in this task? Why do I not want to engage in this task? What a lot of literature has found, certainly from an expectancy value perspective, but then from other theoretical perspectives as well, is that it's these competence-related beliefs that are especially powerfully related to students and other learners' performance, future performance. Those reasons for engagement constructs seem to be much more closely linked to students' persistence and their decisions to continue pursuing a given academic domain. But when it comes to competence-related beliefs, perhaps not super surprisingly, those competence-related beliefs are especially closely and powerfully tied to performance. This is one reason why understanding competence beliefs and knowing how to optimally promote them as an educator is particularly important, because of their close link to the so-called kind of success or performance that students experience. And what a lot of work has shown is even when you statistically control for prior performance, expectancies for success and other competence beliefs constructs are still very powerfully predictive of how students ultimately end up performing. And another point that they make in this section that I think is so kind of important and really makes a compelling point for the importance of understanding competence beliefs and how to optimally promote them within the learners that we're working with, is that students that are performing at the same level but have different competence beliefs show different patterns of persistence and future performance. So what that means, it's kind of related to the point that I just made about even after controlling for prior performance, competence-related beliefs are still so powerfully predictive of performance. What that means is that, again, students that are kind of right at that same level, let's say that students, I know at least in Oklahoma in elementary school, it seems pretty common, starting in the later elementary school grades, to administer some kind of a standardized assessment at the very beginning of the year. Let's say two students, student A and student B, they perform pretty similarly on that beginning of year assessment on language arts, let's say. If student A has much higher levels of competence beliefs compared to student B, what we would expect and what has been shown in the literature is that how the extent to which they persist and the level at which they perform on future tasks and future, let's say, standardized tests are very different, even though they started out the same. But if they have those differences in competence beliefs, then those end up ultimately predicting sometimes dramatically different trajectories, which again, I think is just really interesting. And again, is one reason of many why it's so important that we as researchers and also that we as educators and other socializers really care about learning how to optimally promote competence related beliefs. Okay, a few things. So there are a bunch of sections of the article that I'm not going to comment on, not because they're not important, but just again to make sure that this recording stays relatively brief, and then also to focus most centrally on the reason why we're reading this article this week. But please do go and read those other sections as well. So the last thing that I'm going to briefly comment on are a few of the future directions that the authors mention in the last section of the article that I think are particularly important for us all to think about. The first future direction that they identify aligns a lot with like what we've been discussing in this class most centrally, which is that we really need more work focused on competence beliefs, specifically among students who are minoritized and or who don't identify as racially as white and as middle class, or kind of a mid-level SES, given that white middle class students make up so much of the population that we've drawn from in the motivation literature on previous work. And not only do I think that this is such an important point to amplify in and of itself, but also I really appreciated the way that the authors explained why this is so important. They kind of pointed to two different reasons. They pointed to the increasing diversity within the United States and beyond the United States, and how important it is, given that increasing diversity, to capture all students' experiences. But they also talk about how important it is to focus on students who are minoritized and understudied within the motivation literature as just really important in and of itself. And this is like maybe a little bit tangential, but I really appreciate that they added that second point, because I think that the arguments that are very common actually in our field that talk about increasing diversity within and beyond the United States and how that makes it so important to make sure that we are focusing on lots of different populations of students and their experiences. That's really important. But I also think, and I don't know if this is going to make sense, but I also think that putting kind of increasing diversity aside, it is so important to make sure that our literature on motivation is capturing the experiences and the kind of trajectories and amplifying those experiences and trajectories of all students, particularly students who are so poorly represented within this literature, for reasons that have nothing to do with increasing diversity, that it's just really important, as the authors say, in and of itself. So that wasn't super eloquently put by me and a little bit tangential, but I hope that you're taking away what I'm trying to communicate, which is that sure, increasing diversity is an incredibly important reason. But even if that increasing diversity wasn't happening, I still would argue that it doesn't kind of take away from that crucial importance. Another future direction that they talk about that I think was particularly valuable is a recommended focus on how specific education policies and practices end up ultimately shaping students' competence beliefs. And I really especially agree with that recommendation for future work, that our field is moving in a really exciting direction with more of a focus on education policy and practice, but there's still kind of so much more that I think that educational psychology in general, motivation scholarship in particular, can contribute with more of a direct focus on education policy and practice and the implications of those policies and practices for competence beliefs. And they provide a really nice example from a self-determination theoretical perspective, and specifically Ryan and DC's work on this topic related to, I believe, high stakes testing. And I can't remember the other kind of part of that example that they provided. But anyway, all of that is to say that there's so many crucial unanswered questions related to education policy and practice and their implications for competence beliefs. So I'm grateful to the authors for raising them. The final thing that they mentioned, that I'm going to mention here, that I think was particularly valuable, is a recommended increased focus in future work on the complex interplay across social influences on competence beliefs. So the authors, I didn't include it, or I didn't talk much about it in this recording, but the authors included a whole section, was so valuable, discussing the roles of teachers, parents, and peers on the development of students and other learners' competence beliefs. And the authors make the really valuable point in this future direction section that we need much more work that gets more directly at kind of that complex interplay between these different socializers and how they ultimately end up impacting students and other learners' competence beliefs. So I thought that was really valuable. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the other recording option, which is a podcast episode from Dr. Ellen Skinner through the Division 15 podcast series, I think that her theoretical perspective that she talks about in that podcast recording might more kind of directly get at that complex interplay across and between different social influences. So I will conclude now with just a few different questions for you all to grapple with that I hope we'll have time to return to in our discussion on Monday. First, I wanted to encourage you all to think about something that the authors mentioned towards the very beginning of their article when they're defining different types of competence beliefs. Specifically, a really important point that they make is that empirical work seems to pretty consistently demonstrate that children and adolescents don't seem to distinguish between expectancies for success and other competence beliefs. There's a typo there, that should be plural, competence beliefs. So given this kind of lack of empirical evidence that children and adolescents are distinguishing between expectancies for success and other competence beliefs, is there a reason, do you think, to conceptually distinguish between them in our theoretical models? This kind of alludes to, again, another question related to theoretical integration, which we're also going to be talking about this week. The second question I wanted to encourage you all to grapple with is it a bad thing that students' expectancies and competence-related beliefs tend to decline across the school years? Do you think it's a bad thing? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's neutral? Do you think it depends? And also, this article obviously focused primarily on the K-12 years of education. What do you think happens, especially for those of you that are interested in higher education and beyond? What do you think happens to competence beliefs in higher education and kind of other education learning contexts beyond this point? And then finally, I wanted to encourage you all to think about whether these trends that are talked about in the article, especially from a developmental perspective, do they align with either your own experiences related to your own kind of sense of competence, and or the learners that you currently work with or you've worked with in the past? So as always, huge thank you to you all for listening to the recordings and for coming to class so engaged and ready to participate. Looking forward as always to the discussion, and I will see you on Monday.